Hi, I am Connie Fuchsa with Foote Title Group, and at Foote Title Group we understand how overwhelming the home buying process can be, and we make it our mission and it is our passion to make that process as simple as possible for you by keeping you in the loop every step of the way, by making sure you understand everything that's going on, and by ensuring that you and your home are protected after closing. So today I wanted to talk to you about ownership and what that means and what the different forms of ownership are. Because when you actually take ownership to a new piece of property with a deed, there are several different ways that you can do that depending on who you are taking ownership with and also how you want to own that property with them. So I thought we'd talk a little bit today about that home ownership and how that actually works. So when you determine who you're purchasing a home with and you decide that you want to own that piece of property with them, it will depend on how you want to make sure that your property is owned, how the title will be affected, and if something was to happen to you, how your estate's going to be affected when you own that property and something may happen. So there's a few different ways, and owning the property in these different ways is called your tenancy. So how do you want to own that property? What is your tenancy going to be? So if you're buying a piece of property with an individual person, another person, whether it is a spouse, whether it is a brother or sister, whether it's a friend, whether it's a parent, all of those go into determining how you want to actually have that tenancy. So if you buy a piece of property with someone else, there's several different ways that you can take ownership in that tenancy. Hello, Andre. Thanks so much for joining in. So that tenancy is if you purchase a piece of property with someone else, then you can take your tenancy as joint tenants, as tenants in common, or as tenants by the entirety. Now I'm going to start with the last one first, because tenants by the entirety is only reserved only for married individuals. So if you own a piece of property with someone else, more than likely you will take tenancy as tenants by the entirety. And what that means is if either one of you have some type of a problem and someone files a judgment or a lien against you, then it will not affect the ownership of that property. Each person owns that property 100%. So if one of you were in a car accident, hi Lisa, good afternoon, thanks so much for joining in. If either one of you, let's say, for example, was in a car accident and there was some bodily injury and someone decided to file a suit against you, it would not affect the ownership if it was only filed against one of the owners. Likewise, if one of the owners didn't pay a bill that they owed and someone filed a lien against that person, it would not affect the ownership of the property if they owned it as tenants by the entirety. The other side to tenants by the entirety is that each person owns 100% of that property. So if something happens to one of them physically and they were to pass away, the property automatically, by operation of law, goes to the other person. So it doesn't have to go through an estate process, and no one can claim an ownership interest in that person, that deceased person's interest. And so that's why it's reserved for married individuals, because married individuals typically, that would be how they would expect things to happen anyway. Now, if you're married, it doesn't mean you have to own it as tenants by the entirety, but there's a lot of benefit to being able to do that, as you can see in some of that conversation. So then there's also one of the other tenancy forms, as I discussed, is called joint tenants. Now, joint tenants is very much the same as tenants by the entirety, where each of you own 100% of the property and no one can file a lien or a claim against that ownership without it affecting. It has to be filed against both people for it to affect the title to the property. And also, if something happens to one of those joint tenants, it automatically goes to the other. Now, anyone that is buying a property with someone else, and it can be several people, it doesn't have to just be two, it could be 5, it can be 10, it can be several people. So if someone buys a piece of property with someone else, and they choose to have that type of ownership interest, then that tenancy could be considered joint tenants. Hi there, happy birthday boy. Today's my husband's birthday and he just tuned in to us, so thanks for joining in. So if two people or five people or several people, more than one, wanted to purchase a piece of property and wanted to have those kind of protections, and also wanted the property to automatically go to the other person or the other people if they passed away, then joint tenants would be the way that that would be happening. The third way to take ownership, if it's more than one person taking title to a piece of property or taking ownership of a piece of property, would be tenants in common. Now, tenants in common is where each person owns a divided interest. So if there's two people, each person owns a 1/2 divided interest. If there's five people, each person would own a 1/5 divided interest. And the difference with that is, as we said earlier about judgments and liens, if someone was to file a claim against one of those owners, then it would affect the title to the property as respect to that person's interest. And so if they sold the property, wanted to mortgage the property, wanted to refinance the property, that judgment or lien needs to be taken care of in order for those actions to happen. And so it could hold things up. It creates a cloud on that title that needs to be resolved. And whether that owner pays that off, whether that owner has taken care of it and needs to get it released, whether they negotiate some kind of a situation with whoever placed that lien. The other thing is those individual tenants can actually mortgage their interest in the property, or they could sell their interest in the property. So it sounds a little quirky, but say, for example, there was 5 of us that owned a piece of property, and we were just a bunch of friends that bought a beach house, and one of us decided we didn't want to be in that ownership anymore. It wasn't working in our situation, and so one person, let's say it was me, decided to sell my interest in that property. I could actually deed my interest, my 1/5 interest, to another person, and it wouldn't affect the other owners other than now they'd have a different 1/5 owner as a partner. So that me in that scenario could actually deed my interest. I could actually go out and take out a mortgage as to my 1/5 interest. Again, that mortgage, sort of like a judgment or lien, isn't necessarily responsibility of anyone else, but it does secure against that property. So if any of the individuals wanted to sell it or do something different with that property, it would affect that ability to be able to sell it, because that would have to be taken care of, either paid off, released. It has to go away. So that's how that ownership would be affected. And then the other way with tenants in common that the ownership is affected is if one of those one of those tenants in common passes away, that person's interest goes into their estate. So anyone who has an ownership interest in their estate, children, parents, brothers and sisters, stepsisters, stepbrothers, long lost cousins, anyone that has an ownership interest in that estate of that deceased person would then have an interest in that property with those 4 other remaining people in that example. So it can be a little bit confusing if that happens. Now, a lot of times you'll see people do tenants in common if they're friends, if they're brothers and sisters, because they all do have people that would have an interest if something happened to them, and that's most commonly why people choose that particular form of ownership. But there are some risks there. If one of the owners happens to have a problem, then it can affect the ownership of everybody else for that particular reason. So it's a little bit tricky knowing that. Hi, Julie. Good afternoon. Thanks so much for tuning in. It is a little tricky if you're going to own a property with other people and you want to do it as tenants in common and you want to protect your estate value for those that would have an interest in your estate. There is a little bit of risk there in case one of the other joint tenants has a problem. One of the other tenants in common has a problem. The other thing is, when we talk about who might do this, sometimes you may be having a couple that comes together that are dating, but they're not married yet. Well, they have family on both sides, and maybe both of them came into the ownership with their own funds, and maybe they want to protect those funds until they get married. Would be another reason someone would consider maybe doing tenants in common. People have all different reasons why they choose different ownerships. There's also a provision, and I am not an attorney or a tax accountant, but there is a way for people to be able to set their property in trust for their children and those types of things. And they actually deed the property into the trust, where the trustees are the married couple, if you will, in this scenario. And so the married couple, because it's now in the trust, they would actually have to change their ownership to tenants in common, because the marriage they're trustees now. They're not a married couple, and so that would be another reason somebody might use tenants in common. So think of that specifically as a divided interest that represents different people being able to control their interest in what they want to do with it, whether it's their estate, whether it's financially, whether something was to happen and they needed to borrow money against it. Those would all be affected by that tenancy. The last form of ownership that you could do would be a sole owner. That's pretty self-explanatory. That's why I left that for the last. If you are purchasing a property by yourself, you would own it as a sole owner. You don't have any interest with anyone else. No one else would have an ability to have a lien filed against them or a judgment filed against them or be able to mortgage against it. It's solely you. You get to do whatever you want. You're totally in control of that ownership of that piece of property. So that would be a sole owner. Let me know if you have any questions. I'd be happy to answer any of those. A lot of times when I come up with ideas and things that we need to talk about on live broadcasts that I try to do on Tuesdays, it's usually a topic that someone's asked me about. So that was something most recently that we talked about with MVP that we worked with that didn't understand those different tendencies. And it's a lot to absorb at the table when we're trying to go through that and explain to people, particularly individuals that are not married that are buying properties together, and we're trying to explain this, and there's so much confusion going on at the table because they're working with the sellers. They want to know things about the house or exchanging keys and things like that. So please feel free to share the information, because one of my passions is definitely to get information out there for people about what we do and all of the things that 30 years worth of experience has gotten in my head, but also to try to give you as much as exposure as possible so you can ask questions. And I welcome any questions that you have or topics maybe that you've come across that you think that might help other people. So I'm Connie Fuchsa with Foote Title Group. I did want to point out to you that we do not have a machine that answers our phones. We are live people that like to help you with the questions and concerns you have. We want your home closing to be the simplest part of the process. By that, we make sure we keep you in the loop every step of the way. We make sure you understand everything that you're signing, are there to answer any questions that you have. And finally and foremost, we make sure that you and your home are protected after closing. So if you have any thoughts, questions, need anything, please let me know. I would love and welcome any questions that you have that I can help you out with. I'm Connie Fuchsa with Foote Title Group, because your home closing should be the simple part. Thanks so much for tuning in. Hope you guys have a great evening. Happy birthday.